Welcome back to Free Speech Nation with me, Andrew Doyle. A tribunal ruled earlier this week that a rape crisis counsellor who worked at a support centre for survivors of abuse was unfairly dismissed for expressing gender-critical views. The tribunal said there was, quote, ample evidence that Roz Adams was unfairly treated and subjected to a Kafkaesque internal disciplinary process by managers at the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre. So I'm joined now by co-founder and CEO of Sex Matters, Forstater, and lecturer in public law at the University of Glasgow, Michael Foran. Welcome to the show, both. I want to come to you first because a lot of people will be hearing this for the first time and thinking, what on earth is going on? A rape crisis centre discriminating against someone for saying that sex is important. What's going on?
Yes, it's madness. So Roz Adams was a counsellor at Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre, and it's an organisation that's adopted the view that sex isn't real, that the only thing that matters is a person's gender identity, what they say they are. And in 2021, it hired a new CEO, a man called Mriddle Wadhwa, who identifies as a woman. And this was for a job that was advertised as being a specific job for a woman, running a rape crisis centre. They employed a trans-identifying man. And they...
Who doesn't have a gender recognition certificate.
Who doesn't have a gender recognition certificate, but even if he did, in terms of other people's perceptions and the trust of women who are going there to talk about the most awful thing,
yes.
It doesn't matter whether he has a gender recognition certificate or not. He should not have applied for that job.
Well, also, Wadhwa was on a podcast talking about how women who come along saying that they don't want to be seen by a male counsellor should reframe their trauma. He was effectively saying that bigots can be sexually assaulted too, and they need to work around
Well, exactly that. He said bigots are sexually assaulted too. It was just extraordinary. And so when people wrote in to Edinburgh Rape Crisis and said, I'm concerned about this, they filed those as hate emails.
Right.
And so Roz Adams was working there and she was concerned about this, but also just practically concerned with what she could tell clients who said, am I going to be seen by a female counsellor? And the question in practice was not about the CEO, but it in fact was about one of her colleagues who was a woman who identified as non-binary and had a male-sounding name. And she wanted to be able to reassure a client who was going to see this person that, yes, this person is a woman. And trying to answer that question in a sensitive way ended up getting her into an investigation, and they said that that was transphobic.
I think people are going to be astonished by that. So simply for asking the question, how can I clarify to this victim that she will only be with women? And you would have thought with a rape crisis centre, this is a no-brainer. I mean, the idea that men should be there at all just simply doesn't make sense, does it?
Well, exactly. And they'd gone from being a centre that said they were women only to then they said there are no men here. That was their way of saying there are no men, but, there may be people who used to be men who now identify as women or non-binary.
Yes.
I mean, it puts rape victims, they ought to be able to trust, absolutely, when they come into that situation, and it puts their interests last and the staff's interests first.
There's a lot of confusion here, Michael, just from a legal perspective, in terms of what the Equality Act means and whether people can discriminate in terms of sex. Surely it is the case that a centre which is there to support survivors of sexual abuse should be able to say women only.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the Equality Act itself sets out very clear exceptions that permit sex discrimination to set up services that are designed specifically for people who need them on the basis of sex. And that's what the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre was set up as initially. That's what the position for CEO was advertised as. It was a specific provision in the Equality Act that allowed for women only. And what's shocking about this case is that when rape victims then requested female-only care, they were turned away and denied support from the service. They were told that they were not suitable for this service. And so you're dealing with a context here where ostensibly this is a place that's set up specifically and expressly for female victims of male violence who are told that if they request female-only support, that they should go elsewhere. But they didn't even tell those victims where they could go. The only other place in Edinburgh that provided a female-only service, which was Byra's Place, they had a policy of refusing to point victims there either.
We should clarify, so Byra's Place was set up and founded by J.K. Rowling so that there was a single-sex service available for victims of rape in Scotland, because there wasn't at that point.
Yeah.
And the emails that have been published in the judgment regarding Roz Adams show that the staff members were furious with J.K. Rowling for doing this, described it as hateful, and that, as you say, didn't even refer people on to Byra's Place where they could have had that service.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary to see, you know, it's quite rare that you get tribunals describing disciplinary conduct or investigations as Kafkaesque. It's not normal for a tribunal to describe something as a heresy hunt or an attempt to purge an organisation from people who disagree.
That was a phrase, heresy hunt,
yes,
in the judgment itself.
Yeah, this was not something that commentators have added into this. This is what the judges in this tribunal described what happened.
Incredible. But Maya, I mean, it does seem to me you've had your own case, obviously, which was a landmark case in terms of establishing that the belief that sex is immutable is protected in the Equality Act. Since then, we've had people like Joe Phoenix, Rachel Mead, you know, all of these court cases do seem to point the same way. Why can't activists understand that they can't keep breaking the law on this point?
Somehow the message is not getting through, and employers are turning up and they are defending direct discrimination, which almost never happens. You know, employers have learned that you don't do race discrimination, you don't do disability discrimination, but they still somehow think that discriminating against people with gender-critical beliefs is okay. So, you know, just last week, the Russell Group universities published this statement where they said they would like guidance from the regulator on what illegal speech they can restrict, such as, I think they said racism, homophobia, and gender-critical speech. So they're still thinking that, and this is just the completely ordinary belief that there are men and there are women. It's not even controversial or clever or fancy or anything, that people should be investigated and disciplined and seen as transphobic and hateful, inherently hateful for saying that.
So is the only way that we can defeat this, Michael, through the courts, effectively? Because it looks as though the courts are at least making the right decisions when it comes to these things. Yeah,
I mean, the courts are striking a pretty fair balance here, I think. What we're seeing is that, you know, even in this tribunal, the court was at pains to point out that tolerance is the basis of the law in this area. And it tried to say that it itself was not coming down one side or another as between the competing views at play here. But on the other hand, you know, these decisions don't make sense if you're genuinely agnostic about whether sex is real and that it might matter in some contexts. Like, the tribunal in this context said that everybody who was called as a witness for Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre believed that sex was not real and that it was never important in any context. And it itself determined that sex is important in the context of a rape crisis centre. And so it described the views that were held by those people as extreme, as dogmatic, and that's because they had taken a very, very hard line on this. And the courts are in a position where they're trying to balance competing rights. But at a certain point, you have to recognise that our law does recognise the existence of sex, and it does provide rights based on sex. And when a court is faced with circumstances like a rape crisis centre, it's under an obligation to recognise that too.
Is there a risk, Michael, given that the way in which this ideology has clearly captured major institutions, even a rape crisis centre, where they're prioritising ideological thinking over the needs of victims of sexual abuse, is there a risk that the judiciary, that the law itself could become ideologically captured to the point where these sorts of things are not protected?
I mean, there's a risk that any institution could become ideologically captured. That's a risk, I think, that you have to be cognizant of. I think what we're seeing throughout the course of the last few years is that the courts have been remarkably resilient to this. And so I think that's a good thing. We're seeing the courts applying the law as the law is, rather than as it's been presented by activist campaigning groups who are misrepresenting. Who are misrepresenting this. And not just Stonewall, we're seeing a lot of other organisations that are doing so as well. You're even seeing contexts, you know, in the previous case with Mead, Social Work England, got legal advice that seemed to push them towards one direction that maybe would have resulted in them trying to fight a case that any sensible lawyer would have looked at and said, you can't win this.
Yes. So, Maya, can I ask you about this? You know, what do we do, though, about this situation? Because it does seem to me as though the more that we push back against it, it doesn't seem to matter that the activists have got this view. They're not going to change this view. So, and since the Castor view, surely it should be game over at this point, shouldn't it?
It should be. I think it's the responsibility of the government. It has to go back to the government. If you look at Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre, there was failures in the governance of the Rape Crisis Centre, failures by the regulator, the Scottish Charities regulator. The Equality and Human Rights Commission has done quite good recently, but for a long time didn't clear this up. So it has to go back to the government to say everyone needs to understand that when the law says man and male, it means man, and when it says woman and female, it means female.
But am I wrong in thinking that the government so far has been dragging their heels on this, refusing to clarify that when the Equality Act says sex, it means sex?
Well, I mean, they were trying, and they didn't get to the finish line before the election. So this now rolls over to the next government.
And are you confident that the next government will sort this out?
I hope they will. We're asking every candidate to stand up for single-sex services. It's got to come down to the government to stand up for this.
Is it also the case, though, that with something as egregious as this, the idea that there's a man running a rape crisis centre, if you tell most people, they'll think you're making it up. Similarly, they'll probably think rapists in women's prisons. That doesn't sound real. Men winning gold medals in women's races. That doesn't sound real. It's part of the problem that it all just seems so fantastical. That raising awareness actually is quite difficult. Yes,
absolutely. And he's still running the Rape Crisis Centre even after losing this tribunal. There's been no accountability. And so now, we're seeing these big investigations of the post office scandal. I think there will be eventually a public inquiry about this scandal.
Yes.
But before we get there, we have to get to clarity about the law.
And is his position tenable as the CEO of a rape crisis centre following the damning judgment? As you say, Kafkaesque was the phrase used by the judge.
Yeah, I mean, not only that, I mean, the tribunal was clear that this was a position that was established on the basis that it was for a female, that this was for a woman. The point is that they relied on an exception in the Equality Act to advertise this for females, and Middle Wadhwa doesn't have a gender recognition certificate, so legally is male in all circumstances.
So just to be clear, is that a violation of the law, the application itself?
Unclear. I think the general point would be that this is something that's permissible, that it's permissible for a centre to advertise for this, but there will be some ambiguity there, and I wouldn't be confident to say with any certainty that it is or it isn't.
But why would he have been appointed? If the post was advertised for women only, why would he be appointed, and who by?
Well, I mean, there's two explanations here. One is that Riddle did not disclose any information when the application went in. Mm-hmm. The other explanation is that the organisation that was running Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre didn't care.
Right. Can I ask you, Michael, just on this point about whenever we have these decisions, such as Maya's own case, a lot of activist lawyers do come out of the woodwork and say we should just ignore this decision, it wasn't right. Do you think there is a problem within the community of lawyers when it comes to this, that there is disagreement? I
mean, there's disagreement, and most of the time when lawyers disagree in discrimination law cases, it's very clear that there's reasonable disagreement going on here. I would want to be clear, I don't think there's a widespread problem of lawyers coming out and trying to pan particular decisions. There's some lawyers, some individuals who are doing that, who have not done it for this case, and I think that's because the case is quite clear, quite damning.
Yes.
And there's no real room for manoeuvre here. The judgment can't be fudged.
Right. Maya, just finally, is this going to be the final tipping point? Every time something like this happens, I think, well, that's it, over now. I thought this after the Cass review. I thought, well, but it never seems to go away. But do you think this might be it, though?
No. I think there are a few people who believe that sex isn't real, and then there are lots of people who are rightly scared for their jobs for saying what they know to be true, and those people are still scared. They're still not speaking out, and this is why I think it has to go back to the government.
Finally, just tell us about Sex Matters. Where can people find more information about it? www.sex-matters.org, and they can sign up for our election campaign where we're telling every candidate that they must stand up for single-sex services. Fantastic. Maya Forstater and Michael Foran, thank you very much for joining me.